You probably heard that Crimea is under siege and how the Russians are taking massive hits. Well, all I can tell you is that after carefully analyzing the situation, I can assure you that the reality is much more nuanced. Let's take a look at the latest headlines. Ukraine turns to strangling Russian logistics in Crimea, and it's working! The siege of Crimea. Putin's reign may not survive the impending fall of Crimea. Look, if the mainstream media and Reddit is saying it, it must be true, right?
So bullshit! All of it!
Here's part of what people are missing. What is Ukraine's actual endgame here? Kostiantynivka is being swallowed up. The east bank of Kupiansk is collapsing. Russian forces are only 12 kilometers away from Slavyansk. Why spend all this energy to inflict mosquito bites on Crimea? Ukraine is indeed launching hundreds of medium-range drones against Russian logistics and critical infrastructure. Many Russian telegram channels are raising the alarm bells. Bridges are being targeted, fuel depots are burning, ferries are being hit. Russian authorities have to simultaneously solve the growing crisis and pretend there are no problems.
A great success!
At the same time, there's actually nothing new with Ukraine's campaign against Crimea. I talked about it many times in the past. It's pretty much the same plan as during the summer of 2023. The objective was always to physically cut it off from the mainland. Russian logistics to Crimea depend on the Kerch Bridge as well as on the R280 road, these days often nicknamed the Road of Life. It starts in Rostov, then goes west to Mariupol, Melitopol, and then south through Chonhar into the Crimean Peninsula. For those that have been following the war since day one, you will remember that Ukraine deployed some of the finest NATO weaponry in its arsenal, like Storm Shadow missiles and HIMARS, to reach this objective during the summer counteroffensive. By the way, I released 2 videos, part 1 and part 2, ranking all the NATO game-changer weapons used by Ukraine. If you're interested, link will be in the description below. In 2023, we can mention the Storm Shadow missile strike on the Chonhar Road Bridge on June 22nd, and then against the Chonhar Railway Bridge on the 29th of July. Ukrainian sea drones attacked the Crimean Kerch Bridge on the 17th of July, as well as the Russian chemical tanker SIG in the Kerch Strait on the 5th of August. 2 weeks later, Ukrainian HIMARS rockets struck a Russian S-400 Triumph system near the village of Olenivka on Cape Tarkhankut. As you can see, Ukrainian strikes against Crimea are nothing new. The Ukrainian strategy had some merit, but at the time the means available were insufficient in number to reach the objective. These weapons were also just too expensive to truly saturate Russian defenses in the long run. It's only with the advent of cheap, medium-range strike drones that Ukraine once again was able to threaten Russian logistical networks around Crimea, like some sort of guerrilla warfare from the sky. And let's just say the Russians are definitely feeling the heat. But the question remains, what is Ukraine's end goal? Okay, to lay siege on Crimea, cut off supplies, make life hell for the inhabitants of Crimea. But then what? It's like going on a never-ending series of dates and never closing the deal. This campaign requires a lot of resources, which are not being used to stop the Russian army in other parts of the front. So there must be a pretty good motive. The only explanation that I can think of is that Ukraine is secretly paving the way for a new ground offensive. It's also not a coincidence that in the last weeks, the AFU has been increasing the pressure in the West Zaporozhye direction with shaping operations in the sector of Kamyansky. Apparently, Ukraine's objective is not to regain the 1991 borders, but to force Russia to make peace. Look, all I know is that the last Friedensoffensive backfired hard. And who knows, maybe Crimea is just a decoy to force Russia to concentrate its resources to defend it and keep supplies flowing, when the real objective is elsewhere, such as Melitopol. The fall of this very strategic city could effectively cut off the land route to Crimea and encircle all the Russian forces in Kherson Oblast. For Russia, this would be the nightmare scenario. You have to remember that a good diversion is a move that the opponent cannot ignore, and Russia cannot ignore the crisis in Crimea. An offensive against Melitopol is really the only Ukrainian move that could be worth the risk, because everywhere else Ukrainian forces are on the back foot. That could also explain the recent announcements about Ukraine wanting to recruit 60 to 100,000 foreign mercenaries. To the last Colombian! The push towards Melitopol could be combined with amphibious operations against the Enerhodar nuclear power plant, as well as bridgeheads across the Dnieper. As a matter of fact, just days ago on the 25th of June, Ukrainian special forces planted the yellow and blue flag on the Kinburn split. Nope, because it was reported that the flag was dropped from a drone. Turns out it was just another PR stunt. But you get the big picture. Cutting off logistics in Crimea itself doesn't actually achieve anything militarily for Ukraine. It has to be followed up. It only makes sense if and only if this is all a preparation for some sort of Ukrainian offensive. Or maybe it's to prevent Russia from accumulating enough forces to launch a huge offensive against Zaporozhye. And in that case, like we say, the best defense is offense. However, the first point we'll have to analyze is see how effective these drone strikes are against Crimea. We know that Ukraine is currently trying to impose an aerial blockade on Crimea. And the first step to do so is to cripple Russia's air defense capabilities in the region. The operation has more or less been continuous since 2023, but it really ramped up starting in March 2026. Instead of complex airstrikes like in 2023, this time Ukraine solely made use of cheap medium-range drones. For example, on the night of March 5th, Ukrainian UAV units conducted coordinated strike operations in Kherson and Zaporozhye against a Buk M3 medium-range system, an S-300 launcher, as well as Panzer S-1 and Tor M1 short-range air defense systems. 4 days later, Ukrainian special forces from the Navy targeted Crimea, where they struck 3 Panzer S-1 air defense systems, an Orion UAV base at Kirovsky airfield, and 4 drone control stations. On the 8th of April, a fuel terminal was set ablaze in Feodosia, and a Buk M3 was hit in Zaporozhye Oblast. On the 29th of May, Ukraine's unmanned systems forces destroyed an ST-68 radar near Feodosia and a Panzer S-1 near Novofedorovka, both in Crimea. But that's not all, because 2 Tor M2 short-range surface-to-air missile systems were also hit along the M14 route along the Sea of Azov. As always, for many of these hits, we don't have the aftermath, so we don't know if these radars or air defense units were effectively destroyed. Maybe they're damaged or they just have some scratches. Nonetheless, the final assessment is clear. French OSINT expert Clément Mollin recorded all Ukrainian strikes meant to degrade the Russian air defense cover between January and May 2026. In yellow, attacks against air defense systems, and in orange, radars and electronic warfare assets. If we zoom in, we can see a systematic campaign to destroy Russian radars and electronic warfare assets located in Crimea. If you think about it, this could pave the way for cruise missiles with much larger payloads. Simultaneously, Ukraine aimed at striking Russian supply lines into Crimea directly with drones. It's also possible that for Ukraine, one of the lessons from the summer 2023 counteroffensive was that the air and missile strike campaign was rushed, that it started too late, and that it didn't have time to degrade Russian logistics. So this time around, Ukraine made sure to pound Russian rears for months to leave them completely numb. Between January and May, Clément Mollin geolocated the impacts of nearly 1,000 medium-range drone strikes within Russian lines. Notice the number of strikes along the R280 road going into Crimea. So while we talk a lot about Crimea, pay attention to all the hits around Melitopol. And coincidence, key bridges leading to this very strategic city keep getting targeted. Here are the 4 main types of medium-range drones that Ukraine is using to blockade Crimea. The Bulava, FP2, Ram-2X, and the US-made Hornet. As you can see, they have different ranges and payloads, but the champion is still the FP2, a larger fixed-wing one-way attack drone optimized for mid-range heavy strikes. Recent upgrades allow it to carry a massive 100 to 200 kilogram warhead at a range of 200 to 370 kilometers. It essentially serves as a cheap guided bomb. For example, on May 23rd, an FP2 drone damaged the Admiral Essen frigate in the port of Novorossiysk. Look at the density of Russian air defense fire, and nonetheless the drone hit its target. On June 7th, Ukraine's Code 92 drone unit used FP2s to strike the critical Chonhar bridge linking Crimea to Kherson Oblast. Here we can observe the resulting impacts of the drone strikes. Now remember this image because it's going to be very important later in the video. And 3 days before, an FP2 also hit a Russian Svetliak-class patrol ship in Crimea, 250 kilometers from Ukrainian lines. It's really a low-cost alternative to the Storm Shadow. It requires no fighter to launch, just a mobile ground platform which greatly simplifies operations. While the warhead of the FP2 is smaller than the Storm Shadow, a single FP2 salvo can generate multiple simultaneous threats that overwhelm enemy air defenses more effectively than a handful of high-value cruise missiles. And this is the main problem for Russia. Most of its air defense capabilities were meant to stop enemy cruise missiles, not swarms of cheap drones. So now they're getting completely overwhelmed. Another problem is that although they're facing drones, they still have to keep an eye out for cruise missiles that could sneak through. So we talked about the FP2. Meanwhile, Bulava, Ram-2X, and Hornet drones excel at precision strikes against moving targets. Here we can see a Ukrainian Ram-2X with a Starlink terminal as it tried to target this truck from the company Wildberries. It's essentially the Russian Amazon. In this first-person view, a fuel tanker managed to dodge a Ukrainian Hornet. And guess what? We also have the perspective from the drone pilot. Meanwhile, in this footage, a first Hornet missed a target, but seconds later, a second one destroyed the Russian truck. Because of their limitations in range, these drones are responsible for the bulk of the 200 strikes against the R-280 rolled along the Sea of Azov between May and June. We're not there yet, but the heat is turning up. Even the Russian Telegram page Rybar sounded the alarm bells. On the 25th of May, they started one of their posts by saying, "The situation in Russia's southern regions is becoming increasingly threatening." Since early May, Ukrainian forces have significantly increased the number of drone strikes against vehicles transporting various goods to the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions in Crimea. There is a risk of shortages of certain goods on the peninsula. That's why French newspaper Le Parisien reported, "No respite for the occupier, roads and bridges cut off, fuel shortages, how Ukraine is placing Crimea under siege." And Ukrainian drone strikes continued in June. As part of the latest ones on the 17th, operators of the 413th SBS Regiment raid struck the motor bridge across the North Crimean Canal near the village of Voynivka in the northern part of Crimea. Allegedly, the supports and roadway were damaged. 2 days later, on the 19th of June, the same unit struck a gas storage facility on the Tarhankut Peninsula. 24 hours later, Ukrainian unmanned systems forces struck a multitude of targets, including gas compressor stations in 4 locations in Crimea, the Henichesk Strait road bridge, a tugboat in Skadovsk, various fuel tankers, armored vehicles, a heavy tractor, and multiple logistics vehicles. Since highways and the main roads keep getting hit, many truck drivers are forced to drive on small country roads to reach their destination. But then you'll tell me, Russia can always use boats and ferries to supply Crimea, right? On the 21st of June, the Russian ferry Panagia was struck at the Kerch crossing in Russia's Krasnodar region. The attack also sparked a fire at the Chushka oil terminal. As a result, 5 of the 7 oil tanks caught fire. In response to all these Ukrainian drone strikes against Crimea and the surrounding regions, at 9 a.m., Governor Aksionov stopped the sale of fuel.
Отпуск топлива за наличный и безналичный расчет и за талоны юридическим и физическим лицам будет прекращен. Топливо будет отпускаться только службам, государственным службам, которые обеспечивают жизнедеятельность и безопасность Республики Крым.
Simultaneously, reports from people living in Crimea indicated shortages of water and electricity. Right now, there will be rolling blackouts in Sevastopol, while Russian repair crews work on restoring electricity and water supply. According to the latest news, electricity is back almost everywhere in Sevastopol, but there might still be power outages in other parts of Crimea while new equipment is being installed. Water supply disruptions persist, and wherever there's water, the pressure is low. Gasoline sales have restarted, and no issues with gas supply are to be reported. There are also discussions about storing fuel tanks underground. Many Russian bloggers are extremely angry, asking why Crimean authorities didn't think of all this before all the Ukrainian drone strikes. And you know what? The fireworks continued on the 23rd of June, every day. Ukrainian drone strikes led to the collapse of a span of the railway bridge across the North Crimean Canal in the area of the village of Razdolny. Drones also destroyed the repair train that arrived on location to restore the tracks. The same day, trucks parked near the Chonhar crossing were struck by Ram-2X drones. Russian military bloggers were really angry because this bridge is a known target, and they wondered why air defense was not doing its job. the situation is slowly becoming critical for Russia, because if Ukraine managed to block the ferry connection with Crimea, plus the R280 highway and bridges between the peninsula and the Kherson region, then the next obvious target will be the Crimean bridge in Kerch. And that's the problem as the defender. You have so many installations to defend. There are 7 bridges of various sizes between Crimea and the mainland that Russia has to defend at all costs. The reality is that everything else at the moment is secondary. On the night of the 24th of June, the 414th Birds of Magyar drone unit struck multiple coastal radars. Could it be to pave the way for amphibious landings against Crimea, maybe with some special forces? And then Ukrainian drones also targeted a large electric substation in Sevastopol. Russian military blogger Ghost of Novorossiya wrote that if the current trend continues, the situation in the coming months could be close to critical in terms of deployments and especially logistics. With that being said, Russians are known to be able to take the hits. Ukrainians too. People in Russia have been taught since a young age about the terrible siege of Leningrad. 872 days, starvation, no heating in winter, plus constant bombardments. So many civilians lost their lives, but in the end, Axis forces were unable to take the city. Sevastopol also went through a terrible siege. As a matter of fact, the capital of Crimea is called the Hero City for that reason. So the current situation in Crimea is definitely bad. But when you put things into perspective, it's really not as disastrous as it's being portrayed. Now let's analyze this Ukrainian drone strike campaign against Crimea with a cool head. We see a lot of burning trucks and various drone strikes on critical infrastructure. For sure, all this is spectacular. And yes, these videos are real, but it's important to remember that they appeal to your emotions, to boost your perception of Ukrainian successes. It's similar to the never-ending stream of drone kill cams. Forget about the ground, we're losing!
We are winning!
Overall, we don't know how many drones Ukraine has launched, and how many of those were shot down, so it's hard to evaluate the sustainability of this campaign for Ukraine. According to Russian sources, their air defense shot down 180 Ukrainian drones over Crimea in recent days, for about 25 confirmed hits since June 21st. This means only 12% of Ukrainian drones managed to bypass Russian air defense. That's the first thing. Nonetheless, it's clear that many Ukrainian UAVs got through, and we can expect more drone strikes in the coming weeks and months. The inhabitants of Crimea will either have to leave or seethe and take the hits. The Twitter page Mucklesson wrote, "In May we publicly have about 200 strikes and about 100 damaged or destroyed vehicles, so 3 or 4 per day, a tiny fraction of the total traffic." They say this because pro-Ukrainian media United24 reported that 3,800 cargo trucks drove into Crimea every day. That means a Russian truck has 0.1% chances of getting hit by Ukrainian drones, or 1 in 1,000. So that's the mathematical reality. At this rate, Russia can definitely continue supplying Crimea. The Russian Telegram page Vayenias Vidomitel declared that thousands of cars travel on this route and neighboring highways every day. And to really disrupt the logistics, Ukraine will have to deploy hundreds of drones daily just on this section, which is currently unattainable. So if we do a rough draft, 200 drone strikes to destroy 0.1% of Russian trucks. That would mean 2,000 drone strikes per month to take out 1% of the Russian traffic, and 20,000 per month for minus 10%. And it would require 100,000 drones per month to destroy 1 in 2 Russian trucks going into Crimea. But that's not entirely accurate, because Russian forces are currently working on countermeasures to further increase the number of drones needed by Ukraine. Patrols equipped with heavy machine guns are escorting key fuel trucks and protecting important road hubs with cannon air defense or drone interception teams. In this footage, we clearly see machine gun fire against the incoming drone. But as the Ukrainian drone approaches, everyone runs away. This is what happens when you have poorly trained National Guard units for such an important mission. But for sure, with time, they're gonna get better. That's why Russia has also begun to distribute 30mm anti-air guns to different sections of the rear. Here's a video of one of them shooting down a Ukrainian FP2 drone. Some of the new variants are upgraded with AI to track enemy UAVs. Additionally, Russian interceptor drones are now patrolling the sky to take down enemy UAVs. But there's more. Russian air defense units are also setting up smoke screens over critical bridges to camouflage their targets from incoming guided drones. So as you can see, it's gonna get harder and harder for Ukraine to hit its targets. Nonetheless, the Telegram page Vayenias Vidamitel admitted that this logistics could already be significantly complicated. The costs of moving along the land corridor will become much higher due to destroyed vehicles. Drivers will have to be paid significantly more, and some may start refusing such a dangerous route, which will force companies to expand their staff and fleet of vehicles. You know, it's a bit like the Iranian blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. It's very similar. But you know what? Maybe Russia is going to respond by expanding unmanned vehicles to supply Crimea. That means that for Ukrainian unmanned systems forces, trucks are easy targets but offer low payouts. Critical infrastructure is a good choice because these targets are stationary and they directly impact the population of Crimea. But eventually the Russians are going to repair the infrastructure and they're going to increase the defense around it. But the real center of gravity of Russia's logistics in Crimea are all these bridges. Because if they're destroyed, traffic and the flow of goods effectively goes to zero. Hear me out, only when all these bridges are going to be destroyed, then yes, we'll be able to say that Russia is in a very bad position. A bit like when the bridges over the Dnieper were damaged by HIMARS in the fall of 2022. But Russia has already prepared a plan B with the construction of numerous pontoon crossings adjacent to key bridges like here in Chandhar. Till then, it's mosquito bites. We can believe that while Russia is trying to figure out a sustainable way to defend itself from all these drone strikes, that it is currently concentrating all its air defense capabilities on these bridges. They have no other choice. These bridges represent the lifeline to Crimea. And you guessed it, if Ukraine is really serious about blockading Crimea, it's only a matter of time before they turn their complete attention on these bridges. And they have a huge arsenal of weapons to pick from. Medium-range drones, cruise missiles, USVs, who knows what else they're cooking. That's all I have for you today, and see you in the next one.